it's no accident in the story of Aaron and the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai when they make a god, a figure of a god who rescued them from Egypt. It's no accident that he fashioned the figurine as a bowl.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Attic. One thing I'm really trying to do on this channel at the moment is increase my knowledge of Bible scholarship. I think it's really important that we learn more about where the Bible comes from and who wrote it. To that end, I am interviewing or trying to interview as many Bible scholars as possible. So I'm delighted today to welcome to the channel Dr. Kipp Davis. Welcome.
Thank you, Lloyd. It's fabulous to be here.
It's lovely to have you on the show. You are, of course, somewhat of an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular, but you are also scholar in residence at TWU's Religious Studies Department and Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. Is that correct?
So that's old information, I'm afraid. So yeah,
got to fire my researcher there.
Well, you move on and you forget to update some of your links and your social pages.
Well, you were at one point.
I was. I've been around a bit. My last stopping point was the University of Agder in Kristiansand, Norway. But yes, I do most of my work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I also do quite a bit just within the Hebrew Bible generally.
Sure. And what's really exciting is at the moment, you're doing an online course with the theme Real Israelite Religions, Facts on the Ground, and Propaganda in the Bible, which I think dovetails neatly with our chosen topic today, which is what most Christians don't know about the Israelites. So people can actually access the course using the link in the description, I should mention.
Please do so.
What can you tell us about this course and what does it involve and that sort of thing?
So this is a second year university course that I actually taught at universities, including Trinity Western, which is a Christian and evangelical Christian university. For the online course, I've re-edited it and I've adapted a few things, but the course itself is basically an exploration of the religions against a historical backdrop of what really happened in what we call ancient Israel, and how that compares to what is written in the Bible about what really happened in ancient Israel. And I spend quite a bit of time working through the archaeological parlance of the region, investigate the facts on the ground, what the archaeology actually has to tell us about who the Israelites were, what they believed, what happened to them, and then how and why the Bible tells the story about Israel in the ways in which they did. So it's a course in religions, it's a course in history, it's a course about the Bible. It's 18 lectures. I believe Derek Lambert from Myth Vision, who has produced the course, I believe he told me it's just over 13 hours of material. And when you purchase the course, you have it for the rest of your life. So there's no pressure to, get through 13 hours of course lectures in any time soon. You can do it at your leisure. And I try to, as an instructor, I try to incorporate elements that I'm really passionate about into the course itself. So, as is my as is my want, there's a little bit of heavy metal in there. There's lots of movies and television. So I think it's a lot of fun, as well as a very informative course.
Sounds wonderful. And again, You can sign up for the course using the link in the description. So I guess I'm approaching this conversation clearly not as a Bible scholar. We were saying just off air that it's somewhat ironic that I've only really developed a taste for Bible scholarship since I've stopped believing that it comes from God. But I am bringing to this conversation a background as an ex-fundamentalist believer, in fact, an ex-Jehovah's Witness. And if I were to condense what Jehovah's Witnesses believe about the Israelites, it would go something like this. So the Israelites were a group of people who inhabited Palestine, having spent some time in Egypt, conquered Palestine, in fact, and they were a monotheistic religion that worshipped exclusively the God Yahweh, or Jehovah, as Jehovah's Witnesses like to call him. And their center of worship was Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the only place that was acceptable for offering animal sacrifices, or if you really, really want to dig deep, human sacrifices.
Oh.
So,
did you actually believe that as a Jehovah's Witness, though?
we didn't believe about the human
sacrifices.
sacrifices. No, that's something I found out since then. I shouldn't have included that. So where does the kind of Bible fundamentalist, literalist, or Jehovah's Witness view of Israelites clash with the history and the archaeology?
So in your summary, you were either wrong or mostly wrong on every single count there.
Okay.
So let's start. Most scholars today don't think that, or certainly the Exodus, the movement of the Israelites out of Egypt into Palestine, and then the invasion and the conquest of the entire region of Palestine. Most scholars are agreed at this point that it certainly didn't take place in the way it's presented in the Bible. There was probably a group of people who made that migration from Egypt into most likely the northern part of the region in and around Samaria there.
Well, it was still Egypt, wasn't it? I mean, that's
yes.
a fascinating thing I've learned is that around about that time, Palestine was part of Egypt. So if there was an exodus, they were moving from one part of the country to the other.
Of Egypt to the other, basically.
Yeah.
Yes. So but not a mass migration of these people. There was no conquest of the region. I think the best models now suggest that the emergence of what we call Israel was the result of a social change more than anything. The Israelites were always Canaanites. One of the models suggests that these are Canaanites who lived in the highlands, and not in the large, heavily fortified Canaanite cities. But these were people who lived out in the hills, and they farmed. They were dirt farmers and pastoralists, who eventually came down and took over these larger city states. So that's one model. Another scholar back in the 70s suggested that Israel emerged as part of a peasant revolt against these larger city states. So the Israelites were Canaanites, and they were always there. The city of Jerusalem itself was not by any stretch of the imagination an important or a significant city or a center until probably the 8th century BCE, and as a result of the Assyrian invasion from the north and the destruction of the much more important, larger, wealthier northern kingdom of Israel, which was centered in Samaria. And when that happened, there was a a movement of people out of that area into Jerusalem right around the 8th century thereabouts during the rule of King Hezekiah. And that's when the city started to expand and become more important. And I think this is probably where Yahweh worship maybe wasn't introduced, but became much more significant in this area. And as you suggested, no, Yahweh wasn't the exclusive God of the Israelites. He was the God of the Israelites, kind of like a patron deity or a national deity for many of these groups of people. But based on the archaeology, we can see that for most people living in the region at this time, they maintained a very healthy, active, polytheistic worldview. They were worshiping all sorts of gods. In the temple, in fact, in the temple in Jerusalem, the so-called Temple of Yahweh, there are texts within the Hebrew Bible which indicate not only that there were other gods worshipped in the temple of Yahweh, but Yahweh also had his own Asherah, his own female consort. And Jerusalem, at least early on, was not the exclusive place for offering sacrifices to Yahweh. This is something that happened quite a bit later, and it's pretty controversial. For a time, people were able to sacrifice and worship whoever they wanted, wherever they wanted throughout the region, which is why we have archaeologists, have unearthed, I believe it's it's at least 17 temples throughout the region. In addition to that, a number of shrines or high places where gods were worshipped, including the god Yahweh. And it wasn't until the 7th century, during the rule of Josiah, Josiah came to power, and either on his own, using the priesthood, or as a vehicle of the priesthood, we're not entirely sure, but Josiah and the priesthood together, the priesthood and the Temple of Jerusalem together, embarked on this sweeping campaign of religious reform to eliminate worship, not just of other gods, but all worship, period, outside of Jerusalem.
Well, to be fair, they had conveniently found the book of Deuteronomy at that time. So what were they supposed to do?
Exactly. So, but the whole point of this exercise was to consolidate and centralize the religious power, really, in the city of Jerusalem, at the Jerusalem temple. And yes, but prior to that point, it was much more cosmopolitan, I think, much more, the religion in the region was much more widely practiced and more similar to what everyone else in the ancient Near East was doing. And that included the offering of child sacrifices. Child sacrifices are mandated in the book of Exodus, as well as in the book of Leviticus. And there's a handful of texts throughout the Hebrew Bible which present the practice as normative. And child sacrifices were offered to Yahweh. This is something that came to be regarded as repulsive and a terrible thing much later on, when the writers and the editors of the Hebrew Bible were compiling their texts. So you've kind of got this this cognitive dissonance taking place right within the text itself, where on the one hand you have these instructions from Yahweh saying, "Yeah, give me all your firstborn sons as sacrifices," and then on the other hand you've got him saying, "No, I hate that. That's terrible. Don't do that." So it's
kind of a schizophrenic religion on that regard.
It can feel like that until you understand exactly what's going on, and then when you do understand, it becomes a lot of fun, actually, to see, oh yeah, this is a text that belonged to an earlier period where people thought thought these things, and then later on, ideas changed, new people were in power. They had other more important things to think about. So as a result, they rewrote the hell out of the text they had. So
There are
yeah,
two
it's
things. Yeah, I mean that's fascinating all by itself, and I think we're dragging many viewers perhaps down something of a rabbit hole where they'll be like, "Oh, can't believe it was there and I missed it." Um, a couple of things that I found out recently about the Israelites kind of really were really surprising to me. First of all, again, the fact that they were originally a polytheistic society. I think El was the principal deity, and in fact, El is referred to in the text of the Bible, and it's not just an alternative word for Yahweh, which is how it ends up being presented in the Bible, but I think we've even found statues of or carved images of El that were worshipped. And the second thing is that this thing about worship being centralized in Jerusalem. I think it was Francesca Stavrakopoulou who, in her recent book, had a photograph of a site in, I think, modern day Syria that's since been damaged by the upheaval there. But it is or was the closest approximation to an ancient Israelite temple in existence, and it taught us far more about the way they used to worship back then. Does any of that chime with your knowledge?
Oh, absolutely. And that is a fabulous book. The her book God and Anatomy. So I can one of the things that is fascinating and I think very interesting to people when they first see it is not just this distinction between between El and Yahweh as distinct figures, as distinct deities. And yes, we have there are certainly figurines that have been discovered through archaeological excavations of El. He's always depicted as kind of like an old man sitting on a throne or a chair with a great big beard. We believe there may also be some figurines that have been discovered.
It's no coincidence that you have a beard, just to be clear.
None whatsoever. And this is not a very impressive El beard. His is like
okay,
bushy and oh God, I hope I don't look as old as El does, but I certainly feel like it these days. So, but we also have possibly some figurines and depictions of Yahweh himself. One of the more famous ones is actually an inscription, and it's an inscription with an inscription with a drawing on it from a jar handle that was dug up at a place called Kintilet Arud, which was an Israelite fortress. It dates back to about the 8th century. I think it's 8th century, 8th to 9th century BCE. And it has, in the inscription, it says, to Yahweh and his Asherah, his goddess wife. And then there are a couple of figurines depicted on the object. There's a male figurine standing, and we know he's a male because his great big penis is hanging down, and you can see his testicles, and his head is kind of in the shape of a bowl, which is how Yahweh is often described and referred to within the Hebrew Bible text. It's no accident in the story of Aaron and the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, when they make a god, a figure of a god who rescued them from Egypt. It's no accident that he fashioned the figurine as a bowl. There are sites mentioned in the Bible set up by King, I think it's Jehoshaphat. I might get that wrong. He was the first king of the northern tribes who rebelled against King Rehoboam in First Kings. There are shrines set up at Dan in the north and Bethel in the south, because they don't want people traveling down to Jerusalem to worship in the temple there. So they set these shrines up so they don't have to go there, and to worship Yahweh. And he sets up these bull figurines again. So this is a common image for Yahweh. So that's the Yahweh figure. He's this male figure with a large penis and a bull's head. And then seated on a chair in the background is a woman playing the harp. And this pretty clearly is his Asherah. So yeah, it's fascinating that we have some of this, some of these objects and images which reflect things that we read about in the text, but have also been carefully redacted. Some of the redactions don't, and the editing doesn't survive the test of time very well. There's a famous passage in Deuteronomy chapter 32, which is a very old part of the text. It's called the Song of Moses. It's a poem or a song, and in verse 8 and 9 of Deuteronomy 32 in our Bibles, it reads like this, and it's telling the story of Israel's origins. And it says this, starting in verse 8: when the Most High, or Elyon, gave nations their homes, and he fixed the boundaries of people in relation to Israel's numbers. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his own inheritance. So that's what our Bible translations read, because they're reflecting a later Hebrew manuscript tradition. But then with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a slightly different translation in the Greek, in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. So scholars already knew ahead of time that there's something funny going on in this text that's corrupted. It didn't actually originally read this way. And then when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the neat manuscripts to come out of this discovery contained part of the book of Deuteronomy. It contained this Song of Moses. And at this point in the text, it read quite differently. It said, when Elyon, the Most High, gave nations their homes, and he set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the sons of God. So basically, he's setting the boundaries. He's dividing the inheritance to his
according
sons.
to his pantheon.
Yes, these are divine beings. And then the rest of the text makes a lot more sense, where it says that Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his own inheritance. So
that does make perfect sense. Yeah,
doesn't it? So the depiction here is of the chief god Elyon, dividing the nations among his progeny, the sons of the gods, these divine beings. Every god gets his own little territory, and included among these is little Yahweh, who gets Israel, his inheritance. And I actually think the word there, that's translated as allotment or inheritance, I think is quite important. And it's difficult to square with the idea that Elyon and Yahweh is the same figure, because you don't give yourself an inheritance, and it's within the Hebrew text too. The word, the language never functions that way. It's always about a heritage that you pass on to your children. So it was a really neat discovery in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fascinatingly, this particular manuscript dates to about the year 50 BC. So as late as, the Roman period, long after long after the emergence of Judaism, long after the yeah, after a very long period of time already, uh, you still have a text reflecting this old polytheistic idea at a point in time when supposedly, monotheism is, deeply entrenched. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a neat discovery.
And of course you had that verse in, I think it was Exodus, where Yahweh says, I used to be known by El to your forefathers, but now you should call me Yahweh, which
Yeah.
is kind of like a convenient thing for them to insert. And it also raises questions as to why he has to change his name. But it all kind of makes sense, or it started to make sense to me once I researched the documentary hypothesis.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, as a Bible scholar, how what's your take on the documentary hypothesis, and to what extent is it still used, or can it still be used to make sense of how the Bible was pieced together?
So I know there can be some controversy with regards to this. I oftentimes see proclamations, particularly from evangelical Christian apologists, about the death of the documentary hypothesis and how it's an idea that nobody takes seriously within scholarship anymore. Or I've seen it said from some that that the documentary hypothesis is pretty much an American idea that nobody in Europe take seriously anymore, and that's just not the case. So the documentary hypothesis, for people who don't know, is a theory that was developed back in the mid 19th century, in the 1800s, as a way to explain the composition of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The basic theory is that the Pentateuch was developed from 4 pre-existing sources that are identified as J, the Yahweh source; E, the Elohist source; um, uh, P, the priestly source, which is pretty much mostly, well, no, I shouldn't say that. It's all of Leviticus, but then there's lots of P throughout, Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers as well. And then D, or the book of Deuteronomy, which is pretty much just exclusive to the book of Deuteronomy. And they're provided these names in large part, in particular, J and E are divided on the way in which God is addressed. He's presented as Elohim many times, which is just the Hebrew word for God. And then in other texts, he's presented as Yahweh. And the editor mashed them together, so you got all this transition beat where sometimes he's called Yahweh, sometimes he's called Elohim. Um, it's an
And this was
overly
done, sorry, to make disparate groups who all worshipped roughly the same way. It was all done to kind of satisfy them all, because they would have all
I
had knowledge of different elements of the
something like
story.
that, yeah.
Right.
I think you have to think of this mostly in terms of editors of the text doing their very best to try and preserve as many of their ancient traditions as possible.
Right.
And
Even if those
what
ancient traditions contradict each other.
absolutely. And I don't think this was such a big deal for people either. People in antiquity weren't so hung up on contradictory ideas or different versions of the story which say completely different things, right? um and one of the clues one of the clues which keyed people on to the fact that Moses didn't write the whole Pentateuch, and it's actually a mixture of a bunch of different sources. One of the clues was the fact that there are all these doublets throughout the text. These are the same story basically told twice, sometimes 3 times, and in slightly different ways. You have doublets of, there's 2 different stories about how the region of Beersheba got its name. There's 2 different stories about Rachel's concubine Hagar and the birth of Ishmael. There's actually 3 different stories about Abraham having to lie to the to a ruler about his wife Sarah actually being his sister. And then, there's a third story featuring Isaac and Rebecca. There are multiple stories of the flood of Noah that are kind of dovetailed together, but we can tease those apart and see the separate strands pretty clearly. There's two creation stories. There's there's two stories of the about Joseph and selling him into slavery, which have been dovetailed together. So there's all these doublets throughout the text.
2 or 3 Ten Commandments, I think, as well.
3 versions of the Ten
Yeah.
Commandments. There's the Ten
Yeah.
Commandments in Exodus 20, and then it's repeated again in 28, 29, I think.
Mhm.
And then it appears again in Deuteronomy chapter 5, and they're all different. They're
Mm.
all pretty different. So yeah, this is something that people had noticed and started to develop theories and ideas about what's going on here. And one of the solutions to this was to look at texts where the word Elohim is used with reference to God and texts where the word Yahweh is used with reference to God. It's overly simplistic to try and just look and say, oh, the text mentions Yahweh here. This has to be a Yahweh's text. This text mentions Elohim. Over the years, the theory has been quite refined and developed to the point where a proper expression of it now is that in the so-called Yahweh source, Yahweh is known by that name from the very beginning. So when people address God, they always call him Yahweh, whereas in the Elohist source, he is not known by that name from the beginning, but the narrator may call him Yahweh. He's just never called Yahweh by people who happen to be in the story, not until Exodus chapter 3, where he introduces himself. You used to know me as El Shaddai, but no, I'm actually Yahweh. So that's kind of how the refinement and the division of the literature works pretty cleanly based on that idea. But there's more to it. In one of the sources, in the J source. And if you think about the creation, the 2 different creation stories as exemplars of this, the Genesis chapter 1 is the E, or actually a P, maybe even an exclusively P priestly creation story, or a redaction of an earlier E story by P. But in the first creation story in Genesis chapter 1, God is transcendent. He's out there. He just speaks everything into existence, right? In the Genesis 2 story, which features Yahweh, not Elohim. He's actually called Yahweh Elohim, but this is the first part. This is the first place in the text where the name Yahweh is introduced. He makes things with his hands. He gets down into the dirt. He actually plants a garden. He actually builds the first human being and then all the animals out of dirt. In the first creation story, there's a fixation on numbers. You notice the days are all carefully named and numbered and separated from one another. This is a feature that's pretty exclusive to the priestly writer. You'll also notice in as I mentioned in this first creation story, God is out there. He never comes close to people. He just he communicates through voices in heaven mostly. In the J story, in the J version, God will walk around. He'll interact with people. There's all sorts of stories throughout the book of Genesis of God meeting up and talking with someone. He talks with Hagar.
He even gets into a fight with someone.
Yeah, he gets into a fight with Jacob. He talks with Hagar at a well. There's a story in Exodus where Yahweh stands on top of the rock at Mamre. When Moses goes to strike the rock, and then in the doublet of that story, he's not there. He's in the sky, right? So there's all these subtle differences. We can see differences in terminology that's used. There's different names for things, right? In one source, the mountain of God in the Sinai wilderness is called Mount Sinai. In the other source, the Deuteronomist, it's called Mount Horeb. Moses's father-in-law in one source is called Jethro, in the other one he's called Ruel. Even the names, even the names of the patriarchs, the difference between Avraham and Avram and Sarah and Sarai is part of this. It's part of these separate sources. Same with the names Jacob and Israel. It's the same person. And you see this actually, this is one of the neat things in the Joseph story. You'll notice there is this transition between calling Jacob and calling him Israel, back and forth, right? But when you separate them, when you separate the sources, he's just called Jacob in one of the sources, and he's just called Israel in the other source. So it's all these things. There's literally a mountain of evidence which shows, at a minimum, that there were different sources behind the construction and composition of the Pentateuch. Where scholars tend to disagree now is on whether these were written documents and whether we can isolate them as 4 written documents, J, E, D, and P, or whether it was a more expansive idea where there might have been 2 sources that were combined and then further editorial layers piled on top of that. So there's this is the other more popular, I wouldn't say more popular, but the other popular competing sources theory is something called the supplementary hypothesis, which was developed in Europe and is still quite popular over there. But this idea that that biblical scholars have completely rejected the documentary hypothesis is nonsense. As a biblical scholar, when I teach biblical studies, when I do my own research and work in the Hebrew Bible, I'm constantly interacting with the ideas behind the documentary hypothesis. And all biblical scholars still have to do this. So, but it's neat and it's fun to see, to tease out these details and to see, where one writer thought this and another writer thought something quite different. One of the things that I'm really big on are what I call priestly polemics embedded within the text. There's different groups of priests within the Hebrew Bible, right? And we all know this. There's the sons of Aaron, who oversee the sacrifices in the Jerusalem temple, and then there's the Levites. But what people fail to realize, and you can see aspects of this still embedded within the text, are that these are 2 powerful priestly groups that are in competition with one another. And it seems like there was a time when the Levites were the ones who controlled the shrine of Yahweh, which was in Shiloh, and then it was later on the sons of Aaron, the Aaronites, who came along and established worship of Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple, and ended up kind of shutting the poor Levites out and saying, no, you go stay in Shiloh.
We'll take over from here.
We'll take over from here, kind of thing, right? But you can see some of this throughout the text, not just in the Torah, but throughout the what we call the Deuteronomistic history, which is in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. You can see it in there. In several of the prophets, I've done a lot of my own PhD work in the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is a Levitical priest from this line of Levites, who was at one time basically disenfranchised from the Jerusalem temple. But a fascinating thing happens during the reforms of Josiah. The Levites are reinstituted, they're given lots of their power back. It seems like he's extremely sympathetic to this old group of priests, including Jeremiah. And this is kind of Jeremiah and his family. It's their into the corridors of power again. And that's kind of how his career as a prophet begins. He begins as a big cheerleader for Josiah. And there's a couple of the early prophecies in the book of Jeremiah are like, rah, rah, yeah, Josiah's the best kind of thing, right? But then, of course, Josiah dies and the political climate in Jerusalem changes pretty dramatically. And, once again, Jeremiah is kind of pushed out and he's very upset about this. So his message starts to change pretty dramatically. And
He doesn't
he's
have nice things to say about Jerusalem.
no,
Yeah.
not at all. And then there's still, these you've got these reminiscences about, the good old days back in Shiloh when we used to be in charge and we're the big shots. So this stuff is fun.
It's really interesting to hear you talking about the documentary hypothesis and sharing your angle on it, because it sounds similar to the argument that creationists or fundamentalists will make against evolution. Sometimes you'll hear them say, oh, well, evolution is false because it's just a theory, which is obviously not understanding the scientific use of the word theory. And then they'll say, and besides, evolutionists are arguing with one another as to how evolution occurred, therefore it must be false. That doesn't negate the theory of evolution. All it means is that there's healthy debate about the kind of the finer details of the process of evolution by natural selection. And it sounds like there's a similar thing been going on here with the documentary hypothesis. Yeah,
exactly right. When you hear evangelicals or critics say, oh, well, the documentary hypothesis has been debunked because look at this book by Jacob Berman, or look at this other book by I believe it was Rentdorf back in the 80s or the 90s, who are totally arguing against the documentary hypothesis. But what they fail to realize is they're not arguing for single authorship of the Torah. Yeah, they have problems with the documentary hypothesis, but what virtually every scholar agrees about is that there's sources behind the Pentateuch. And those scholars who have been, critiquing the documentary hypothesis are not remotely enthusiastic about the idea of single authorship or great antiquity. As a matter of fact, many of the critics have come out and said, you guys who hold to this documentary hypothesis are totally wrong because you date the sources way too early. If anything, many of these guys are pushing the date of the Pentateuch way later, like setting the entire thing in the post-exilic period.
Right.
So it's just one of those things that Christian apologists continue to get completely wrong.
Sure. So speaking of the Pentateuch, and again, there are these very clear voices that you can think of as components that have been sort of stitched together. Again, as a Jehovah's Witness or fundamentalist, you're coming at this and you're saying the first 5 books of the Bible were written in the wilderness by Moses. Obviously, another problem with saying that is that the same books describe Moses' death, which must have been pretty tricky for him to write about. Do you believe that Moses existed?
Interestingly, I think that Moses, no, but I think there was probably a charismatic figure, or I should say, there could have been a charismatic figure who led this group of migrants out of Egypt into the north of Israel. And in fact, what's really interesting is that So we actually have an inscription, a very early Hebrew text. One of our very earliest Hebrew texts is very fragmentary, and it seems to be reflecting on this early migration tradition. And it identifies a figure simply as the prophet. And this is interesting because in the book of Hosea, it's Hosea chapter 12, and I encourage people to go and look at that. In Hosea chapter 12, which was written sometime around the 8th century, so much of this stuff we can sort of trace back to the 8th century. This seems to be an important time where, like I said, the Assyrians came in, they destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. There's this big migration to the south, to Jerusalem, and this seems to be the point in time where a lot of these ideas started to converge and come together. And certainly within the book of Hosea, which was written in the 8th century, he includes in chapter 12 there, one of his oracles is reflecting on and riffing off of these origin stories of where we came from. And you can see two distinct traditions in there. One to do with the patriarchs, with Jacob. He comes out of Aram. He falls asleep in Bethel and has a dream about a stairway to heaven. So there's these Jacob traditions in there, and they seem to be associated with the southern kingdom, with Judah. And then there's these other traditions which speak about coming across the Red Sea, about coming out of Egypt, about signs and wonders. And these are always associated with Ephraim, or the northern kingdom, Israel. And these also make mention of a prophet who leads them. So we actually have some reflection back from the earliest period on what has become the Exodus tradition, but the charismatic leader figure is not named. He's just this anonymous prophet. So I think, I have no problem with a figure like that in existing behind these traditions, which eventually came to be the Exodus story, but not Moses. There was no Moses.
And when you say there was no Moses, you're talking about the historical archaeological facts.
The Prince of Egypt, who the literary figure, the character who is preserved in these Exodus traditions. This is a fiction, and I believe I don't know Egyptian, but in some of the reading I have done, it's been suggested that the actual name Moses is it's like it's like how do I put this? It's like an Israelite or a Hebrew version of what they think an Egyptian name would sound like. You know how sometimes when you meet people who were born in countries in Asia or in the Caribbean or in Africa in the 1950s and 60s, sometimes they're named Elvis. It seems to be kind of a popular name among people who came to North America, from abroad. They immigrated in the 50s or the 60s, and it's because the most popular person, in America at the time was Elvis Presley. Was the only, American anglicized name that lots of these people knew. And when they were pressured to, choose a more pronounceable name than the one they were born with, many of them picked Elvis. it's kind of like that, where the writer of these traditions in Exodus seems to understand that this word Moshe is a, I don't remember the technical term, but it's an element that gets attached to Egyptian names. Tutmos is a good example of this, right? Yeah,
It's
it's
an
an
obvious
Egyptian
fabrication. Is
aspect,
that
but it's,
what
yeah,
you're
it's like,
hinting at? Yeah.
it's one of those things where an Egyptian actually wouldn't name their child Moses,
Yeah.
or Moshe.
It's
And then
not
with
a Hebrew name,
it's not a
and you
Hebrew
can't
name.
even say that it's an Egyptian name. It's
It's
an
not really
attempt
an
at
Egyptian name.
creating an Egyptian name that might
Trying
sound
to make
plausible.
something
Yeah.
sound Egyptian, right?
Right.
And then something, this is the same. What happens with the name Moses is something that happens with lots of names in the Hebrew Bible. You can see there's a Hebrew meaning that's attached to the name Moshe. He was drawn from the water. It's not really a Hebrew word though, and it's one of these things that's made up, right? You see it similarly with Yahweh. The name Yahweh. Yahweh was a deity that is not native to the Israelites. He was imported from somewhere, most likely. It seems the Midianite region to the south and the east of Israel seems to be where this deity Yahweh came from. And you can see that he's not native to the Israelites, because in the story of Yahweh's introduction to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, he says that his name is, he literally says, I am Ehya, which means I am. Ehya is not the same as Yahweh, but this is the explanation of where the name comes from. It's because it's not a native Hebrew word. They're kind of going, well, it's pretty close to this word, so maybe it means this, which means I am. We still have no idea what the name Yahweh actually means or where it came from. But it's not Hebrew, and it doesn't mean I am.
Interesting. Which is
And
again
it's
the
probably
opposite of.
wasn't pronounced, and it probably wasn't pronounced Jehovah either.
Oh well, it definitely. I think we can say it definitely wasn't, because Jehovah is just a mishmash, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Of European letters, and it was.
So
I think, yeah.
There's a deeper story to this when because at a much later period of time, the Jewish people came to regard the name as so sacred you couldn't even pronounce it anymore. And as a result, when they encounter the name in the text, so this is the other thing about Hebrew is the language is consonantal. There's no vowels in it. The vowels just come through learning the pronunciation of the words, right? But at a later point of time, this is during the rabbinical period, so in the medieval period, around 500 600 AD or CE, Jewish scribes invented a pointing system. They added dashes and dots underneath the consonants to aid in pronunciation. And when it came to the divine name Yahweh, in an effort to ensure that it was never pronounced, they decided, well, we're not going to provide vowels that you can actually say. We're going to provide vowels that make it impossible to pronounce. And what they did with that word, Yahweh, is they took the pronunciation, the vocalic pronunciation of the word in Hebrew translated as Lord, which is Adonai, and they just added those vowel points underneath the consonants, Yod, He, Vav, He, so that whenever someone reading the text encounters that word and they see, well, you can't really pronounce it using these vowel points, so we'll just say Adonai.
They
And
made it sound like gobbledygook when people
yes,
were reading
but
it.
leave
Okay.
it to, later Europeans to say, we can pronounce this. And then basically invented this modern pronunciation Yehovah, which is difficult. When you see it written in Hebrew, you can tell, yeah, that doesn't work, but
Yeah.
they tried.
And it made it into the King James Version, which was the Bible of choice of Charles Taze Russell when he was founding what later became the Jehovah's Witness movement, which
There you
is
go.
how we arrived at Jehovah. Well, this has been fascinating. It certainly whetted my appetite to have you back on the channel at some time and go over this in more detail. And viewers, if you want to learn more about what the Israelites actually believed and who they were as a people, again, check out the link in the description and sign up to the course. But Dr. Davis, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on this subject.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I know I have. Don't forget that you can enjoy similar videos by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.
Not for